'Tis February 1944 over East Anglia. A Junkers reconnaissance crew climbs through pale winter sun and brittle cold, the cockpit smelling of hot oil and antifreeze, while the North Sea wind rasps along the canopy. Below Airfields the Luftwaffe had catalogued for years, Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, Hardwick, no longer look familiar. Dispersal pans bristle with shapes like spilled mercury. Taxiways shimmer with queued machines. The camera clicks, film spooling, as hangar doors yawn and a fresh line of fortresses noses toward the runway. The pilot notes the sound first. Not a few Merlins and Cyclones warming, but a low, continuous grind as if the island itself has become a factory. He banks, tracing contrails that stitch the sky in new density, and wonders where these aircraft have come from. No new British fields have appeared on their maps, and Allied factory counts in December had not promised this. By late February's big week, the answer arrives in aluminum and fire. Out of cloud banks, hundreds upon hundreds of B-17s and B-24s resolve into columns, the sunlight flashing across glazed noses, the exhaust a bitter taste in the air as German fighters claw up through the wake. A ground observer near Brunswick later writes of a horizon that would not end, streams stacked and steady, close enough to seem welded together. Intelligence officers argue over decoys and doctored photos, but the negatives on the table are stubborn. The runways truly are fuller, the turnover faster, the formations thicker than last month. Somewhere far from this sky, on a concrete slab smelling of cutting fluid and hot steel, a factory man has removed the kink in the world's bottleneck. To understand the storm building over Germany, we have to step off the flight line and into his line. By mid-1942, the war's decisive front was no longer the skies above Europe, but the assembly lines below them. Every bomber downed over Bremen, every Spitfire lost above the Channel could be replaced or not, depending on which side's factories could keep pace with destruction. Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy had transformed America from an isolationist nation into an industrial war machine, its output surging from 6,000 aircraft in 1940 to nearly 48,000 only 2 years later. But for all the triumph in the numbers, cracks ran deep beneath the paint. Aircraft were still being built like custom jewelry, hand-fitted, adjusted by eye, assembled by craftsmen rather than mass-produced by system. One missing rivet pattern or misaligned bulkhead could halt an entire fuselage line. In Michigan, the Ford Motor Company believed it could change that. At Ypsilanti, the new Willow Run bomber plant, an expanse of concrete and glass so large it needed its own fire station, hospital, and power grid, was meant to turn aircraft into another Model T. Henry Ford had promised a bomber an hour, but the first months delivered humiliation. The B-24 Liberator was a masterpiece of aeronautical complexity. More than 200,000 parts, 5 miles of wiring, and 313,000 rivets. Each section came from a different subcontractor. When joined together, they refused to fit. Skilled machinists from Detroit found themselves lost among unfamiliar aluminum frames and aircraft tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Supervisors blamed the inexperience of farmhands, now turned riveters. Engineers blamed the designers for an airplane too intricate to mass produce. In the midst of the noise, one man studied the chaos differently. Charlie Sorensen, Ford's quiet production genius and architect of the original Model T line, saw the problem not as mechanical, but procedural. The assembly floor, he realized, still treated aircraft as singular creations. To win the war of production, they had to become a continuous flow. Metal moving like a river, not a series of dams. It was a revelation that would soon reshape every hangar and factory across the Allied world. In the dim quiet of Ford's Dearborn headquarters in 1941, Charlie Sorensen, broad-shouldered, methodical, and streaked with the oil of 3 decades in industry, stared across a sea of blueprints and frustration. He had spent his life refining the rhythm of machines. The Model T had once moved through his assembly line like a living organism, each motion timed, each worker an artery feeding progress. Yet at Willow Run, the bomber plant he now oversaw, he found chaos masquerading as craftsmanship. Liberators stood half-finished in scattered bays. Crews swarmed one aircraft at a time, ladders clanging, wrenches misplaced, men walking miles each shift just to fetch a part. It was, to Sorensen's eyes, not a factory, but a carpenter's shop enlarged to absurdity. One winter night, A snow scratched the tall windows, and the last shift clocks echoed across the empty floor. Sorensen unrolled a strip of brown wrapping paper and began to draw. What if, he thought, the bomber itself moved? What if instead of craftsmen circling a stationary airframe, the plane advanced, nose to tail, through a sequence of precise timed stations? In his sketch, a bare fuselage entered at one end and emerged complete at the other. Engines mounted, wings bolted, guns installed, paint dried. Each step flowed into the next like a melody, no pauses, no retracing steps. The parts would not pile in storerooms. They would arrive just when needed. It was the discipline of the automobile, translated into aviation. When he carried his rough plan to Edsel Ford, the younger Ford read the crude pencil lines in silence before nodding. The flow line, as Sorensen would name it, promised not just faster production, it promised rhythm, predictability, and scale. Within months, Willow Run would be rebuilt around that vision, and the world would learn whether one man's sleepless sketch could teach airplanes to move like cars. By the spring of 1942, the prairie outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, no longer smelled of wet hay or machine oil from scattered barns. It smelled of molten aluminum, welding flux, and ambition. Rising from the frozen ground was a building so vast that workers joked you could rain inside one end before the droplets reached the other. Willow Run, 3.5 million square feet of concrete and steel, the largest single-room factory ever constructed. Its ceiling soared 40 feet high, crisscrossed by gantries and cranes built to hoist entire wings as if they were fenders. At full stride, it housed more than 40,000 men and women, farmers, shopgirls, students, and housewives turned riveters, each learning the discipline of seconds. Everything at Willow Run was movement. Sorensen's flowline vision shaped every detail. Fuselage frames slid forward on conveyor tracks. Overhead cranes swung engines into position. Precision jigs locked pieces in alignment. Instead of scattered workshops, the B-24 Liberator advanced nose first through a mile-long artery of progress. Parts arrived in kits, pre-assembled modules delivered exactly when needed, a concept so efficient that idle hands became a rarity. Yet early results mocked the dream. Tools shattered under relentless strain, aluminum warped in winter drafts. A missing crate of rivets could paralyze an entire section. Critics sneered, calling the place Will It Run? A monument, they said, to Ford's arrogance. But Sorensen refused surrender. He walked the lines at midnight, grease on his hands, urging foremen to measure, refine, and never halt. Shifts became continuous, the plant alive every hour of the day. Gradually, disorder hardened into discipline. Men and women moved with practiced rhythm. Inspectors found fewer flaws. The great belts never stopped. By year's end, the impossible factory was doing the impossible. One B-24 Liberator rolled out every 63 minutes. High above Europe, German observers saw the result. A sky growing denser by the hour, August 1st, 1943. Dawn broke over the Mediterranean in a haze of dust and glare as more than 170 B-24 Liberators droned eastward from Libyan airfields, their wings trembling under full bomb load. The target was Ploiești, Romania, Hitler's vital oil lifeline, pumping fuel for every Panzer and Messerschmitt in Europe. Among the aircraft were dozens stamped with Willow Run serials, fresh from the Michigan floor, where steel had been shaped into thunder. Pilots could still smell the primer paint and factory oil baked into the fuselages. Below them stretched the blue of the Aegean, calm and deceptive, while ahead lay the most heavily defended industrial site on the continent. When the formations thundered over the Carpathians at treetop height, German flak crews were stunned. Reports crackled across the Luftwaffe network, describing an endless procession of four-engine bombers, far more than intelligence had deemed possible. Black smoke and tracer fire clawed the sky, tearing apart whole sections of the force. Yet even as Liberators fell burning into the wheat fields, new waves surged behind them, tight in pattern and numberless to the defenders' eyes. A captured German officer later admitted disbelief. "We thought we were fighting one raid. It was several wars at once." Nearly one-third of the attacking bombers never returned, but Ploiești's refineries burned for weeks, and the greater revelation lay not in the damage inflicted, but in the speed with which the losses were erased. Within days, Willow Run and its sister plants replaced every aircraft destroyed over Romania. The Luftwaffe had learned a terrible truth. that American factories could outbuild destruction itself. An industrial hydra, one German analyst wrote, each head cut off returns two. From that day, strategy shifted. No amount of valor or precision could defeat a nation whose assembly lines produced faster than flak could kill. By autumn 1943, deep inside the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch in Berlin, analysts pored over aerial reconnaissance photographs that defied logic. The images showed a colossal rectangular complex west of Detroit, vast, geometric, smoking by day, and glowing in perfect symmetry by night. It was unlike any factory in Europe. They called it Das Phantomwerk, the phantom plant, because no one could explain how it worked. The smokestacks suggested round-the-clock operation, yet output reports from Allied prisoners of war hinted at something beyond comprehension. Captured B-24 crewmen described bombers being built like cars, rolling forward on belts while teams bolted and riveted in motion. German aeronautical engineers laughed at the absurdity. Such claims, they insisted, belonged to fairy tales. Aircraft construction demanded precision hand-fitting, not conveyor belts. But disbelief turned to anxiety when monthly intelligence summaries revealed a disturbing trend. B-24 production was not merely steady, it was accelerating. In July 1943, American factories had produced 428 Liberators. By October, the figure exceeded 600. Serial numbers photographed on wrecked bombers near Bremen and Brunswick differed by mere weeks, meaning replacements were entering combat faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Analysts submitted warning reports to the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, only to have them dismissed as exaggerations or Allied disinformation. The idea that an enemy could build bombers with the efficiency of automobiles was too grotesque to be real. Yet the evidence grew impossible to ignore. In a private conference, Armaments Minister Albert Speer confided to Hitler that the Americans have made production an art. Their factories, he admitted, were not workshops, they were living systems. In desperation, the Reich launched Unternehmen Steinbock, the so-called Baby Blitz, hoping to cripple British industry before it became unstoppable. But even if German bombers could have reached Michigan, it would not have mattered. Sorensen's flowline had already transformed America into a self-replicating engine of war. By 1944, Willow Run pulsed like a living organism, 85,000 heartbeats moving in unison beneath one roof. The air was thick with aluminum dust and the rhythmic thunder of rivet guns. Women in bandanas, Rosie the Riveters made flesh, stood shoulder to shoulder with men too old or too young for the front. Farm girls from Iowa drilled wing spars. Former store clerks learned to seal fuel tanks. Teenage apprentices threaded radio wiring with surgeon-like precision. Sorensen had designed every tool for their hands, simple to use, foolproof, but engineered to aircraft tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Make it so anyone can do it, but no one can do it wrong, he told his engineers. The plant became a self-contained city, a wartime metropolis of motion. Cafeterias served thousands at a time. Libraries and training halls educated workers in physics and blueprints. Nurseries cared for their children, while mothers built the machines that carried their husbands into the sky. Beneath the roar of conveyor belts, people carved tiny acts of pride. Initials scrawled beneath instrument panels, hidden signatures on aluminum skins. When the 5,000th Liberator rolled out, its engines coughing into thunder, the entire workforce paused in silence. They watched it taxi into the daylight, many knowing their own loved ones might soon fly inside its shadow. There were no medals here, no battlefields, only fatigue, noise, and repetition. And yet every precise movement was a blow struck for freedom. Sorensen's mechanical genius had done more than transform a factory. It had awakened a human engine capable of sustaining a global war. As the assembly line roared without rest, its creations soon converged over Europe, toward flak-blackened skies where Germany's last defenses waited. By February 1944, the grey skies over Britain no longer belonged to weather. They belonged to wings. Across East Anglia and the Midlands, runways glistened with frost as ground crews moved among endless rows of bombers, their fuselages gleaming pale silver in the dawn. Willow Run and its sister plants had done their work too well. Dispersal fields bulged beyond capacity, hangars overflowed, and temporary taxi strips had to be carved from pasture. What had begun as a dream of a bomber an hour was now tangible metal, an industrial tide ready to lift into the air. The 8th Air Force, once a handful of squadrons, had become an armada of steel. On February 20th, Operation Argument, later remembered as Big Week, ignited. Over 3,000 bombers rose from English soil, climbing through layered cloud toward the German industrial heartland. Radar stations from Kiel to Cologne lit up with panic. Controllers could not mark their plotting tables fast enough. The moving grease pencils smudged under their own momentum. Luftwaffe fighters clawed into the sky, engines howling, but the targets multiplied beyond comprehension. Major Hans-Ulrich Rudel would recall it as an endless tide of silver monsters. No gaps, no end. For every formation broken, another loomed behind it. Losses were brutal. Hundreds of bombers failed to return, but by week's end, replacements had already arrived. The hangars that had emptied were full again before the oil stains had cooled. It was the invisible triumph of Sorensen's flowline, a tempo that could replace destruction faster than it could be inflicted. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but its struggle was now mathematical, not tactical. A war of production measured in minutes and tonnage. And from that point on, the air over Europe no longer belonged to men. It belonged to the machines that men had learned to build without pause. By spring 1944, the thunder of Willow Run's production had created a new kind of battlefront. One fought not in the skies, but in the intricate arteries of logistics. For every bomber that rolled off the line, an entire shadow fleet of engines, tires, and propellers had to follow. Fuel shipments, hydraulic fluid, oxygen tanks, and radio components all had to synchronize with the same rhythm Sorensen had imposed on his factory floor. To sustain this pulse, the U.S. Army Air Forces built a parallel empire of supply, convoys of freight trains and Liberty ships, each carrying pre-crated assemblies stamped Willow Run Annex. Every week, thousands of spare engines and propellers left Michigan bound for ports in New York, Liverpool, and Karachi, ensuring that no squadron stood idle for want of a part. Sorensen's flow principle had become contagious. North American aviation adopted it for the P-51 Mustang plants in Inglewood and Dallas. Douglas used it for the C-47 Skytrain lines in Oklahoma and Illinois. Boeing perfected it in Seattle, where flying fortresses emerged with the precision of clockwork. Across the Allied world, chaos became choreography. Disassembled Liberators were even shipped by rail to Florida, Morocco, and India, reassembled near the front to save shipping space and time. The assembly line, once confined within a mile-long factory, now stretched across oceans and continents. In Berlin, Albert Speer could only watch with despair. Despite tripling armaments labor and forcing entire camps into production, the Reich's scattered workshops could not match the American rhythm. Each new Liberator meant another German train. Diverted, another tank unfueled, another city left unprotected. By the eve of D-Day, the equation was settled. Allied factories had not just built air superiority, they had built air abundance. The war's balance was now measured in minutes, not miracles. By early 1944, war strategy itself had begun to take shape, not only in map rooms, but on production charts. The rhythms of Willow Run and its sister plants no longer merely supported campaigns. They dictated them. General Dwight D. Eisenhower called logistics the winning weapon, and the proof rumbled across Europe in the form of thousands of bombers built faster than destruction could claim them. With B-24 availability doubling in less than a year, Allied command gained a luxury no force had ever possessed: choice. They could strike oil refineries one day, marshalling yards the next, and synthetic fuel plants by week's end, without pausing to rebuild their strength. In March 1944, this strategy reached its crescendo. The combined bomber offensive, coordinated strikes by the 8th and 15th Air Forces, obliterated 75% of Germany's aviation fuel production in mere weeks. Luftwaffe. Squadrons found themselves grounded not for lack of courage, but for lack of kerosene. Allied intelligence intercepts recorded desperate German messages. The attacks never cease. Our airfields cannot recover. It was industrial warfare distilled to its essence, attrition by abundance. The Germans had entered a duel of exhaustion against a nation whose factories never slept. American planners now wrote strategy in the language of production. Mission orders assumed predictable losses, 10% gone each sortie, yet the daily factory rhythm absorbed the deficit effortlessly. For the first time, logistics and combat merged. The pulse of an assembly line in Michigan could be felt over Berlin. Each wave of liberators that darkened the German capital carried not only bombs, but proof of inevitability. Charlie Sorensen's flow line had transcended engineering. It had become a doctrine. The front was no longer defined by geography, but by tempo, and America's industrial heart had learned how to fight in time. As 1944 turned to 1945, the pulse that had begun in Michigan now echoed across the Pacific. Charlie Sorensen's flow line principles, once confined to Ford's bomber plant, had crossed oceans and adapted to a new kind of war. Consolidated Aircraft used them to organize production of the B-32 Dominator, the heavy successor to the Liberator. Douglas applied the same logic to the C-47 Skytrain, streamlining assembly, so transport planes could leapfrog supplies from island to island across the world's largest ocean. Even the front itself became an assembly line. On Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, engineers carved runways into tropical coral and built miniature flow lines for servicing B-29 superfortresses, machines far larger and more intricate than any aircraft before them. Here, under the relentless Pacific sun, the same choreography prevailed: fuel, munitions, and maintenance crews working in sequence, hour after hour, like stations on a mobile factory floor. A damaged bomber could land at dawn and rise again by dusk, its engines replaced, guns reloaded, tanks refilled. The pace soon became unbearable for the enemy. By February 1945, B-29s launched nightly from the Marianas, dropping over 100,000 tons of bombs each month on Japan's industrial heart. Japanese officers watching from Tokyo's rooftops sent frantic cables claiming enemy planes appear as if grown from the sea. The illusion was not magic, but mathematics, the inevitable consequence of a system built for flow, not pause. The logic that once produced cars on a Detroit line now sustained empires across oceans. When Tokyo burned beneath a storm of incendiaries, the last truth of modern war stood revealed. Geography had yielded to production, and its origin traced to one man's conviction that movement, steady, synchronized, unbroken, could win a world war. The triumph of Willow Run came at a terrible human cost. Beneath the shining fuselages and proud statistics lay a factory floor that never slept, where the air shimmered with heat and the clang of steel drowned out thought. Workers endured 12-hour shifts under blinding lights, the smell of oil and aluminum dust settling on their clothes like armor. Turnover soared as exhaustion and injury spread. Some collapsed beside their stations. Others vanished after payday, unable to face another week of monotony and noise. For all its efficiency, the line was merciless. It demanded movement without pause, precision without rest. Even Charlie Sorensen, the architect of the miracle, was consumed by it. Worn down by corporate feuds and the strain of endless oversight, he fell ill and left Ford in 1944, his body broken by the very rhythm he had created. The system he designed to save democracy had, in a sense, devoured its maker. Veterans of the factory later spoke with pride and unease in equal measure. "We didn't build bombers," one woman recalled quietly. "We built death machines." Yet history's verdict was more complex. The same industrial discipline that shortened the war also redefined what labor could achieve. Proof that ordinary citizens, when bound by purpose, could master extraordinary precision. Across the ruins of Germany, survivors of Allied raids described their disbelief. Fleets destroyed one day reappeared the next, immaculate and innumerable. The Luftwaffe's spirit had broken long before its wings did, defeated by factories they would never see. When peace finally came, Willow Run's endless belts slowed, the great hangars emptied and the noise faded into silence. But its pulse never truly stopped. The logic of flow, born in a single sleepless sketch, would echo through every jet engine, every car plant, every nation that learned to build faster than war could destroy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, The world that emerged was already moving to a new rhythm, the rhythm forged at Willow Run. Charlie Sorensen's vision of continuous motion, of machines and men synchronized into one unbroken sequence, became the cornerstone of post-war industry. Aircraft builders led the way. Boeing's 707 and Douglas's DC series jets followed the same logic of sequential assembly that had once birthed the B-24. Components now advanced in steady progression. Each section fitted, tested and passed along like notes in an industrial symphony. What had begun as a wartime necessity had become an engineering philosophy. Automakers across the globe adopted the discipline of aerospace precision, bringing military tolerances into civilian life. In Japan, engineers studying American plants refined Sorensen's idea further, giving it a new name, just-in-time production. It was the ultimate irony, the perfection of an American wartime innovation reborn in peacetime Japan, destined to dominate world manufacturing for generations. Meanwhile, Willow Run itself transitioned from bombers to automobiles and electronics, its vast hangars now echoing with the hum of peacetime prosperity. Historians would later call it the birthplace of continuous production, a phrase that barely captured its quiet revolution. But its truest legacy was not measured in machines. It lay in the realization that industrial speed, precision harnessed to flow, could decide wars faster than weapons ever could. In the 1950s, former Luftwaffe officers touring America stopped before the silent expanse of Willow Run's floor, struck dumb by the magnitude of what they saw. Here they finally understood why their skies had filled with endless bombers, why resistance had become futile. The age of flow had arrived, an era where victory, progress and power would all march to the same relentless, rhythmic beat. In the final measure, it was not a general's strategy or a pilot's courage that changed the course of the air war. It was a worker's idea, drawn in pencil on a strip of brown paper. From that humble sketch to the thunderous rhythm of Willow Run, Charlie Sorensen transformed the act of building into an act of warfare. Germany's defeat began not with bombs, but with organization, with a production line that never slept, never paused, never broke its cadence. In that unending motion lay the quiet revolution that overwhelmed the Reich's most brilliant tacticians and silenced its vaunted Luftwaffe. When historians trace the rise of air power, they find its true turning point not in combat reports or ace tallies, but in the long corridor of a Michigan factory where riveters worked in harmony and aluminum wings inched forward, minute by minute, toward flight. Every B-24 that lifted from an English airfield carried within it the pulse of that place, the proof that coordination could outmatch chaos, that rhythm could defeat rage. And when the war ended and Willow Run's lines fell silent, its emptiness spoke louder than the roar it once contained. It stood as a cathedral of effort, built by ordinary people whose labor had won the sky. Sorensen's miracle had indeed doubled production overnight, but its truest victory was timeless, the triumph of imagination, discipline, and unbroken movement over the machinery of war itself.